I'm John G. Morris. I've been a journalist for all my life. I decided that I wanted to be a journalist when I was only 15 years old, and I was in the University of Chicago High School, and we had a weekly publication called The Midway, and I was the proof editor. And for some reason, I got the bug of journalism, and I decided I'd like to be an editor. So when I went across the street to enroll in the University of Chicago, I tried out for the Daily Maroon, which came out then 4 days a week, and I made the staff and got my first experience of putting out a newspaper. I was only 16 when I started there, and I drifted into picture editing because I'm a lazy writer, and I was lucky enough to meet some very talented photographers very early in my life. I met my first Life magazine photographer in 1937. His name was Bernie Hoffman, and he was assigned to the Chicago Bureau of Life. And my first professional job was assisting him for 1 week when he was assigned to do a story on the University of Chicago for Fortune. So I was paid $25 for that week. That was $5 more than the starting pay I got when I got a job the next year at Time Incorporated in New York as an office boy. The week I spent working with Bernie Hoffman was in September 1937. I had already graduated, but it was depression, and since there were no jobs, I hung around school for a year of so-called graduate study. I didn't really study much, but I put out a monthly magazine called Pulse, which was intended to combine the serious surveys of Fortune, the breezy news of Time, and the pictures of life. And there were 5 student photographers. 4 of them became professionals. The 5th went to hell. He became a college president. But one of the photographers was Myron Davis, who became the youngest member of the Life magazine staff and covered the war and MacArthur's War in the Pacific. And another was Paul Berg, who joined the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Another was John Corcoran, who joined Science Illustrated. And another was Paul Wagner. He's the one who became a college president. Anyway, I loved working with photographers. Photographers are kind of like children, and I have known hundreds of photographers. I've interviewed them. I love to discover a new talent. Those were very, very difficult times. Not only depression, but wars began with the Spanish Civil War in 1937. And there was a Hungarian photographer who was in exile in Paris. His name was Robert Capa. And in 1936, shortly after the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, he made a picture of a dying Spanish militiaman, which became kind of an emblem of that war, and it's been much discussed to this day. And that picture was published first in Europe, but it was also published in Life in 1937. It was published in Life only a year after it was taken, for the simple reason that Life magazine didn't start until November 1936. And I'll never forget when it came with its first issue to my fraternity house at the university. And it was a beautiful, big format magazine, photographs very well reproduced, and only 10 cents a copy. And I decided that's where I wanted to work. I was lucky because when I started I had to start as an office boy at $20 a week. But my colleagues were from Harvard and Yale and Princeton. I was the outsider. The rest were mostly Ivy Leaguers. But advancement was rapid in Time Incorporated in those days. The company was constantly expanding, and there was so much news to cover. And I just went with the tide, and I got one internal job after another. In 1939, I was transferred to the Life editorial floor, the 31st floor in the old Time and Life building on Rockefeller Plaza. And one day as I came out of the men's room, Wilson Hicks, the picture editor, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Did you ever work on a newspaper?" And I knew the answer should be yes. I knew that he had worked on the Kansas City Star. And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, the Daily Maroon." So he laughed. But a few days later, he brought me into his office as one of his assistants. And through that, I got to know all the Life photographers, both the staff people and the freelancers. And it was just a great way. And I love thinking pictures. I would sit with Hicks and his other assistants and decide, should we send Eisenstadt to do this? Should we send Karl Maydans to do that? What about Peter Stackpole? I mean, Margaret Bourke-White. It was fantastic. And so I got to know the top level in photojournalism at a very early age. And the advancement came fairly fast. In 1941, I was transferred to Los Angeles to the Coast Bureau, whose job was primarily at that time to cover Hollywood. But in June 1941, I was sent out there to cover the news. But I pinch hit for the Hollywood correspondent Dick Pollard for several months, and made the rounds of the studios. It was great. I was only 24 years old, and I was a Hollywood correspondent for Life magazine. But my 25th birthday was memorable. It was a Sunday, and I was out throwing a football around on the street with a friend. And my wife was baking a birthday cake. And about noon, she called down and said, "Hey, I had the radio on. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor." Wow, that was some birthday. So I called Sid James, the bureau chief, who was also out in his street playing football. And Sid said, get a photographer and go downtown to Little Tokyo. We'll see what's happening. So I raced downtown. I wasn't going to be late for my first war, but the streets were very quiet, and the Japanese Americans were very smart. They mostly stayed inside because there was almost immediately great feeling about the Japanese. Instead of being called Japanese, they were forever. They were Japs from that time on. So I met a Life photographer, John Floria, who was not then on staff, and we covered what there was, but there wasn't much action. And but we nevertheless did what we could. Wound up in the FBI office in the middle of the night, and then there wasn't much action there either, actually. But the FBI had already rounded up hundreds of people they put on who were on their suspect list. In 1942, I was transferred back to New York, and in '43, with the war at its worst, I was given the job of picture editor in London for Life. And so in October 1943, I sailed on a Norwegian freighter with John Scott of Time magazine, who was being sent to Stockholm, and 9 Canadian Red Cross girls and a cargo of bacon and eggs. We sailed from St. John's, New Brunswick to Liverpool practically by way of the Azores, because there was a German submarine attack on westbound shipping at that time, and we wanted to avoid that. So I got to London. Of course, all of England was under blackout. I had been to England once before as a student. I had spent the summer of '35 in youth hostels cycling around England. And this was quite different. I spent my first night at the Savoy, and I wound up living for 14 months sharing a flat on Upper Wimpole Street with Frank Shurchell, a life photographer. And my job was to get ready to cover the invasion of Europe. We all knew it would happen. We just didn't know when or where. And the Germans were especially invited not to know. And it turns out I was 9 months early. The Germans had attacked London in the Battle of Britain in 1940. They had mounted daytime attacks, and the RAF managed to repel that and save London. Hitler thought he was going to take London that year, but it didn't turn out that way. But there was a little blitz in the winter of 1944. I was living with Frank Shurchell in the 4-story house of a dentist on Upper Wimpole Street, and there was downstairs there was a wonderful couple, Lloyd something and his wife. Lloyd was a professional Toastmaster. He had a booming voice, and when there was a serious air raid, we would hear him call, "Gentlemen, if it's getting a little noisy, would you like to come down for a cup of tea?" So we'd go down. But in people who tell air raid stories, who survive to tell air raid stories, are the lucky ones. Only once did I ever take shelter in a real air raid shelter, which happened to be in the basement of Dean House, where the Time Life office was, on Dean Street. And I'll never forget that night because it got very noisy, and I was working, went down in the basement, and it was a community shelter. I was talking with a woman who was holding a 3-year-old kid in her lap. And I said, "What's the boy's name?" And before she could answer, there was a crash outside, and the building shook, and the lights quivered, but that was it. And then after a moment of silence, she said, "His name is Larry." I just love Londoners. Finally, D-Day came on June 6, 1944. By that time, all the correspondents who were actually going out to cover it had left London one at a time. Shurchell simply, my housemate, Frank Shurchell, had been assigned to the Air Force. He had already flown missions with the Air Force. And one morning he simply wasn't there. He was forbidden to even say goodbye to me. I had no idea where he'd gone. And the same with Robert Capa and Ralph Morris, who had come over from New York, and Bob Landry, with whom I had worked in Hollywood, and George Roger, who was a local hire. He was an Englishman. George later became one of the founders of Magnum, and with Robert Capa and Cartier-Bresson and Shem. But that was my team plus Capa, that was my team for D-Day. It was a wonderful bunch of guys. And I think maybe I didn't mention Dave Sherman, who was assigned to the Navy. And Morse's assignment was Patton's Third Army. He didn't go in on D-Day, but Landry ended up landing on Utah Beach, and Capa on Omaha. Omaha was where the worst fighting was. I don't know if you've seen the film called Saving Private Ryan, but the combat scenes which open that film, which are very severe, were modeled on inspired partly by Robert Capa's pictures that showed what it was like. So anyway, D-Day came on Tuesday, June 6th. It was a cloudy day in London, and I remember very clearly looking out as when I opened the blackout curtains in the morning, looked out and thought, oh my God, what a day. And about within an hour, there was an announcement on BBC that Allied troops had landed somewhere in France. They didn't disclose locations, but the Allies had hoped to persuade the Germans that the landing was going to be somewhere else. But of course, by this hour, there was severe fighting, especially on Omaha Beach. So I went to the office and to be there with the darkroom staff. We had a darkroom with 4 young darkroom assistants and a lab chief. See, men were hard to find in wartime Britain because almost everybody who was physically fit and young enough was young enough was in the Army. There was nothing to do all day Tuesday. We heard nothing from the photographers. We had all this background material. It was holding back for the real stuff. And then we slept in the office Tuesday night, and again waited all day Wednesday. Had still no word, and by this time it was a desperate situation because the whole world was waiting for those pictures. Here was one of the greatest military operations, and perhaps the biggest military operation in history, and no pictures. This was before television. There were 5 newsreels. There was a newsreel pool, just as there was a still pool. Life was part of the 4-way still pool with the 3 wire services. And there were 5 newsreels, and they were worked in liaison with the service cameraman. But anyway, it turned out as it turned out. Capa was the only press photographer to land on D-Day on Omaha Beach. Bob Landry landed on Utah Beach. I had thought there would be an AP photographer also landing on D-Day, but he didn't make it until the following day. Bert Brandt of Acme, which was the United Press affiliate in London, came back at midnight on Tuesday with a picture that was the only virtue in it. It could say it was the first picture. He barely got his feet wet. I don't know which beach he landed on. It wasn't Omaha. So there was a guy named Colonel Butler. He wasn't really a colonel. That was his nickname. Of AP was the pool editor, and he kept screaming at me, "Don't you have any pictures?" So finally, Wednesday evening, early evening, a courier arrived with with a packet from Capa. Thank God. So in it there was a note saying, "John, all the action is in the 35 millimeter." And there were 4 rolls of 35 millimeter film. He had shot 120 on the channel crossing, but on the actual landing, he had shot only 35. So we were under terrible deadline pressure, mostly from the wires who needed pictures to be wire photoed immediately. But also it was getting late for us, even though our deadline was the following morning. So I ordered the darkroom to give me contact prints for editing as fast as possible. To send a picture back to the States, I had to submit the individual negative and 4 small proof prints of it to the censors. I had to do that for every single picture, with a caption, of course. And so it was a laborious procedure. But when Capa's film came in, I rejoiced, but my joy was short-lived, because a few minutes later, a young darkroom assistant said, "John, Capa's films, they were ruined. You were in such a hurry for contacts that I put them in the cabinet to dry," which was normal. He had hung the 4 rolls of 35, but he said, I closed the doors to make them, so that the heat they'd dry faster, and the emulsion ran. Dennis Banks, the kid who did it, thought that all was lost. I rushed back to the darkroom with him and held up the rolls one at a time, and yes, there was nothing on 3, but on the 4th there were 11 frames, and then we printed every one. So those are the films, those are the pictures that signify the D-Day today and show how rough it was. There are other pictures made that day by the service photographers, but nothing as dramatic as Capa's. In 1939, I was a young assistant to Wilson Hicks, and on the 31st floor of the Time Life building. Wilson was the picture editor of Life, the photographer's boss. There were 2 executive editors of Life, Wilson Hicks for the photographers and Dan Longwell for the writers, and they were somewhat competitive. Robert Capa was already famous for his pictures of the Spanish Civil War, which he had begun covering long before Life started as a magazine. The Spanish Civil War started in 1936, before Life did. And then Life had published his famous picture of the dying militiaman as a lead a year later, when they were reviewing the progress of the Civil War. So I knew about Capa. And when Capa came to New York for the holidays in 1939, he came in December. He came up to the Time Life building, and I remember there was a great titter, especially among the young women. He was a very handsome guy, a very charming guy. And we were so different. But for some reason, I guess because I was working for Hicks, in fact his boss, although he was a freelance, we met and hit it off, and I soon became sort of kind of a member of his family. I remember being invited to a party at Julia Capa, who was called Mother Goose because she made a home like the nursery rhyme for all the kids who were in this photo gang. They called them the Bagel Gang from the Bronx. It included Ralph Morse and Yale Joel and his girlfriend Eileen and and Phil Schultz, and I was invited to a Hungarian lacho at their house. So even though Capa and I were so different, I was very envious of him. I mean, he was actually 3 or 4 years older, but and he had all the charm. But I was lucky to get into his circle. One day, he came to the office at lunchtime, and it was a time when a number of us used to go down to the Rockefeller Center rink to skate at lunch, skate our lunch hour. And we invited Capa to go with us, and he was a great skier, but I'm not sure that he was not such a great skater. And he grabbed the arm of a pretty life secretary and was going around the ice, and the two of them tripped and fell, just went kerploop right in front of a plate glass window behind which some Time Life executives were having lunch, and it was a hilarious scene. At any rate, Capa was a lot of fun, even though he was covering deadly things. I mean, the only relief he could get was to get away. So when he was not actually out doing something, covering the war, he was trying to enjoy life. And it was through him I learned to drink. I never learned his attraction, how to attract women the way he did. I was always happily married, so it didn't matter. But anyway, we became friends. I used to call him my Hungarian brother. When the war ended, Capa resigned from life. I mean, he had a contract with Life, but he was not on staff. And I also resigned from Life in the spring of 1946. I was offered a job at Ladies' Home Journal as picture editor. Capa had after when he quit Life, quit working for Life, went to Hollywood. He had fallen in love with Ingrid Bergman, or more to the point, she had fallen in love with him. And Capa had aspirations to get into the movie business. He, in fact, played the part of an Egyptian in a minor part in one Hollywood film. But Hollywood was not for Capa. For one thing, it's very hard to get around in Los Angeles if you don't drive and have your own car. And he was a terrible driver, and I think he smashed up a car out there. But anyway, he came back. His affair with Bergman broke up, and he came back to New York in the spring of 1947. And I was then picture editor of Ladies' Home Journal, and we had lunch, and he told me that he and John Steinbeck, he was hoping to go to Moscow with John Steinbeck, who had been invited by the Russians. And Steinbeck had told the Russians he would go if Capa could come with him. So I saw that as an opportunity for pictures for Ladies' Home Journal, and got him to promise first look. I was delighted to get the first look away from Life, and sure enough, when he came back several months later, I saw him immediately. Had another lunch at the Algonquin, and he told me he would show me his proof prints if I'd come to the hotel where he was staying. So the next day I went through hundreds of 8x10 prints that had been made from his coverage of Russia. he was disappointed with his own stuff because they had been restricted a lot. They'd been followed around by the KGB and denied permission to photograph things like railroad stations and bridges and things. The Cold War was beginning. But I found his pictures quite fascinating just from a warm human standpoint. But I needed, for the Ladies' Home Journal, I needed color. And Capa, up to that point, had had very little color published, just some for Collier's. But I said, "Where's your color?" And he hadn't even looked at it. And it turned out he had about, I don't know, maybe 20 rolls of 120. And I was looking for a picture for the cover, and I found one of a Russian peasant woman looking into the camera. And he told me the story. He said that she waved a cucumber at him and saying, "If only you men were as good as cucumbers." But at any rate, those are the kind of stupid things I remember about Capa. So I had this one picture made up for a cover, and I took it to the journal office with a flap over it, and I had all of the black and white prints, several hundred of them. And I went in to see Bruce Gould with this cover under a wrap, and he said, "Well," I said, "I just want to show you what Capa did in Russia." And he said, "Yeah." So he began looking at the pictures, and he was fascinated, as I had been, by the very human look of the Russians. I mean, these were appealing pictures. And he said, what can we do with it? And I said, "I think we can do a cover story." So then I unflapped the picture, which is all made up with Ladies' Home Journal logotype and everything, just exactly the way it was eventually published. And then I saw, he thought, And then his wife, Beatrice, came in. And he turned to her and said, "Bibi, here's Capa's Russia with Steinbeck as for captions. And John thinks that we should do a cover story." And then she looked, and then she got the bug. So then he turned to me. This is Bruce Gould, turned to me and said, "How much will this cost us?" And I knew that Capa would have been thrilled with $5,000 or $10,000, but I said $25,000. The reason I said that was that Gould was accustomed to paying $25,000 for a major feature, like a serial by Pearl Buck or Mary Roberts Reinhardt. And so $25,000 wasn't that big a deal for him. And so he said, "See if you can get it for 20." So I said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "What about Steinbeck?" He said, "I'll take care of Steinbeck." The way he did that was to call Elizabeth Otis, Steinbeck's agent, and say, we want to run these pictures of Capas and with some captions by Steinbeck, and how much. He got her down to $3,000. Steinbeck was furious when he eventually heard how much Capa had gotten for the photographs. But at any rate, so that was, you can see why Capa and I have hit it off. And then it was not long after that we went to Iowa together. I had this idea of doing an international series called which we ended up calling People Are People the World Over. For years, the journal had done done reports on the daily life of Americans' families, rich or poor, east or west. But my idea was to do that around the world. So the Goulds said, well, you can give it a try, see what you can do with an Iowa family, and then we'll think about it. So Capa and I flew to Des Moines. There's another funny reminiscence. We no sooner got in the plane at LaGuardia when he had taken off, then he asked for oxygen. I said, what the hell is going on? He said, best thing for a hangover. And so we spent the night in Des Moines with the ex-wife of a Coles, and then the next morning drove out US 30 looking for an Iowa farm. And we soon found one. We found a wonderful farm in a little town called Glidden, Iowa. And they agreed that we could come back the next day and start work. So Capa and I, having found our objective very easily, decided we'd go to the hotel that night and celebrate. Then we realized we had forgotten one essential ingredient. We hadn't any liquor, and Iowa was a dry state. So I'm a Midwesterner, and I realized there might be a solution. So as we drove along the highway, I spotted a big roadhouse, and I said, well, we might just be able to get a beer here. So we pulled in, and we were, it wasn't quite evening, so we were the first customers. We sat down in this big dance hall, and a waitress came up and said, what would you like? And I said, can we, she said, I said, I know, but can you just give us 2 beers? And she said, don't you know it's Sunday? And in disgust, I said, okay, just bring us 2 scotch and sodas. And she said, would you like Haig and Haig, or Doers, or Johnny Walker? If they were going to break the law, they were going to break it good. So that was Iowan hypocrisy. And but then that night was the night I got a message from my sister saying that our father was dying, and she was going to Chicago. So I had to leave Capa to do the story, to do the pictures alone. But it was a great experience. I worked for Ladies' Home Journal until late '52. That was 6 years. And during that time, Magnum was founded in 1947, and I was very close. I knew, in fact, I'm the only person who ever knew all 5 of the original founders of Magnum, because the 5th founder, photographer founder, was Bill Vandervert, whom I had met in Chicago long before Capa ever knew him. Vandervert had been was a life photographer based in Chicago for a while, and I had met him shortly after I met Bernie Hoffman of Life in Chicago. And then Bill was transferred to London, and at any rate, and that's where Capa met him. But I was close to Magnum from its founding, but I was not a founder. Actually, Magnum had several non-photographer founders. Bill Vandervert's wife, Rita, was actually the first president of Magnum. And Len Spooner, who was an editor in London, was also a stockholder. But in 1952, Capa came to New York, as he usually did to be with his family at holidays. And he said, it's time for you to join us. And up until that time, I had just been giving occasional advice. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we can put you in charge internationally, and we'll pay you twice as much as we're paying our New York bureau chief. And I said, how much? I said, how much does she get? He said, $6,500 a year. And I was making $15,000 a year. So he said, twice as much would be, I said, twice as much would only be $13,000. And he said, but you'll get to come to Paris. So I said, okay. So I started there. I soon got up to 15, but at any rate, it was not the place to get rich. Magnum was tough. We brought in some new photographers. Elliot Erwitt joined. Bruce Davidson joined. In Paris, Marc Ribou joined. When I say joined, they first came in not as members. They first came in just as participating photographers, and they would, and then we established rules where they would have to work. They would have to be voted in as members. In the beginning, Capa simply named the members of Magnum. But in 1954, early 54, Mainichi in Japan offered Magnum, offered Capa, it was really Capa, not Magnum, some money, a good deal of money to come to Japan and photograph whatever he wanted to photograph, and to bring a Magnum exhibition. So he gladly accepted that. And we were all relieved. But he had, after about 2 weeks after he got there and had gone to work, I had lunch with Ray Mackland, who had succeeded Wilson Hicks as the picture editor of Life. And Mackland said, we need a replacement for Howard Socherek in covering the French war in Indochina. The French were having it very badly there. This was the time of Dien Bien Phu. And he said, would Capa substitute for Socherek while Socherek goes on home leave? And I said, well, I hope not, but I guess I'll have to ask him. I said, I hope he'll. I don't want him to go, but I'll have to ask him. So I cabled an offer. I said, Life is offering you $500 a week to go to Indochina, as we then called it, for 4 weeks. Well, that was pretty good money. It was the same money that we used to get in covering movies. And to my horror, he said, okay. And it really spooked me. And when I went home that night, I decided to call him, and I managed to get him on the phone in Tokyo. We sort of shouted at each other across the Pacific. And I said, you don't have to go, it's not our war. He said, well, don't worry, I'll be back soon, I'll see you in Paris. So he went, and then on the 25th of May, and it was a day I'll never forget. For me, the day started in a small town in Missouri where I just finished teaching a Missouri workshop. And when I woke up on that morning of May 25th, I got a phone call from New York from Inga Bondi of Magnum saying, "John, I have terrible news. We just got word that Werner Bischoff was found dead in his wrecked car in Peru." Werner was a great Swiss photographer who had become a member of Magnum, and he had rented a car and was driving the length of South America on assignment for the oil exploration firm called Schlumberger. And with a friend, he'd gone off a mountain in Peru, and the car had been found a couple of days later. And that was Werner and his wife Rosalina had spent Christmas with us in Armagh, and Rosalina had told my wife that she was quite pregnant. And so when I heard the news from New York, I said, "Does Rosalina know?" And they said, "Well, they had just gotten a message from the Swiss consulate in New York." And I said, "Well, for God's sake, get word to her through her doctor." And she said she would try. So then I was talking in Mexico, Missouri. Mexico is the name of the town. I said, I'll get back as fast as I can. So I got a ride to Chicago and then flew to New York, and my wife met me. And when we pulled into our home, the phone was ringing, and it was a life researcher and calling, and she said, "I suppose you've heard the news. May I ask you some questions?" And I said, "Yes." And then she started asking me questions about Capa. And I said, "What?" And she said, "I thought you said you'd heard the news. Capa died today." It was just too much, and for one day. So I had to drive into New York, and the news about Capa had already made the papers, but few people in America knew anything about Werner Bischoff, and I was determined that he too would be recognized. So I made a three-way call to the New York Times and AP and UP and dictated information about Capa. Well, about both of them, but mostly Werner. They knew a lot about Capa. So that was that day. And the next morning, I met with Cornell and Julia and Edie, and to discuss the funeral arrangements. And there had been suggestions that he be buried at Arlington, and that was no good. We didn't want him to be buried as a war hero. And there was a suggestion that he be given a Jewish funeral. And we said no, he was really non-denominational. So I had recently been to a Quaker funeral. I had joined the Friends, the Society of Quakers, after the war, and because of their promotion of peace and good causes. And I had been to a Quaker funeral and saw that it was just a meeting of friends who could speak spontaneously. I described that meeting, that funeral, to the Capas, and they thought that would be a nice way to do it. So that's what we did. We had a funeral, a memorial for both Werner and Bob at Purchase Meeting in New York suburb. And it was quite a thing. There was I remember tributes poured in from every direction. I think Ingrid Bergman sent one, but finally Cornell arose in the first row and recited the Jewish prayer for the dead, and sat down, and then Julia stood up and wailed. It was just something. And anyway. I think that's all I need to say about Capa. By 1961, Magnum and I had begun to get a little tired of each other. And I parted company with Magnum in a slow way. I was always interested in the journalistic side of Magnum, not so much in the work of photographers as art or commerce. And I developed a monthly package called the Magnum News Service to syndicate to newspapers. And I continued to edit that. I established my own office in the same building with Magnum. And then in 1962, I guess it was, 62, 63, no, 1963, I formed my own company called Independent Picture Service and took a whole floor in that building at 15 West 47th Street. And then I began working with all kinds of, with freelance photographers of all kinds, including Magnum, and also with some other clients like Charles Eames, the designer, for whom we did a lot of work. So, but we ran out of, I raised $60,000 in capital, but we ran through our money in just a year, and the Washington Post then hired me. I left the Washington Post 14 months after I started, but I had a wonderful time there in a way. It was my first experience running News Color, and the Post was then in competition with the Evening Star, which had invested in color presses. So the Post had to as well. And we did some really interesting stuff. So then I became picture editor of the New York Times on Labor Day, no, on Memorial Day weekend in 1967. And I had a great time. We greatly enlarged the picture desk. We moved the photo lab from the place where I had been on the 9th floor down to the newsroom. And I hired 2 or 3 very bright assistant picture editors, one for foreign, one for national. In 1967, I was totally opposed to the war in Vietnam. I was trying to figure out how America could get out. My wife, this is my second wife, Marjorie or Midge Morris, did a book called War and/or Peace, which contrasted pictures of war and peace. And it was a very powerful book. I could show it to you. And it was published by Harper & Row. And I wanted to continue on that. And I wrote a preface to that book, which is a very strong anti-war statement. And I was concerned, it was just about, I was writing that just about the time that that Clifton Daniel offered me the job at the New York Times. And I told him about it, and they said, would that prevent my becoming an editor here? He said, no, not at all. So that was reassuring. So I felt that the Times was open-minded about war and peace. And the turning point came when the picture by Eddie Adams of the execution of a Viet Cong suspect in Saigon came over the wire from AP one afternoon. It came about 3 o'clock, and when I saw that picture, I realized what it was, how strong it was, and was determined to get it played on page 1. So the Times used to have a preliminary page 1 meeting with all the editors at 4 o'clock, and then the real page 1 meeting would be at 6:30, and that would be the tight meeting. But in order to make sure that that picture would be used, I showed it at the early meeting that day, and just said, this is a remarkable picture. And then by the 6:30 meeting, it was only a question of how it would be used. And it was decided that it could be used. Fortunately, a picture of a Viet Cong atrocity also came over the wire that day. It wasn't such a strong picture, but it enabled the editors to use both pictures on page 1, and they felt better about that. But they also, the major play was to the Eddie Adams picture, and of course the Times was not alone in using that picture. It was used by newspapers throughout the world. But that was a turning point, and then there were others. The picture by Nick Ut, you'll see over there, there's a picture, there's a signed picture, a copy of the Nick Ut picture. You see the little postcard size Nick Ut naked girl picture, the napalm victim. Anyway, Nick sent that to me. He was in, I've met him a couple of times. I admire him a great deal. And he sent me that picture and all it says is, "Peace, John." I appreciate that. I first came to Paris 5 days after the Germans left town. The date of the liberation was August 25th, 1944. And all 6 of Life's London-based photographers entered Paris on that great day and sent the pictures, their film back to London. As soon as I had edited that film, I began wangling orders to go to France myself, because I had my eyes on the Paris bureau. I wanted to become the Paris picture editor for Life. Unfortunately, a guy named Elmer Lauer got ahead of me and by marrying a French gal, and they figured his French was better than mine, which is true, although his was atrocious, which says not much for mine. And anyway, so I got to Paris, and I just fell in love with the beauty of the place. And I wrote home to my wife, after I have a copy of the letter, saying, someday we must live in Paris. And 39 years and 2 wives later, I made it. So that's how I came to, and I never regret it. I still have kids in the States, but I'm happy to live here as long as I can, as long as I live, which is, who knows. I became a member of the OPC so long ago I can't tell you the date, but my first my earliest memory of the OPC was a luncheon at the Waldorf, I think presided over by Ed Murrow. I think CBS used to have an annual event with OPC, at which the CBS correspondents from all over the world used to come in for a New Year's broadcast. And the OPC invited them to a lunch at the Waldorf. And Harry Truman, who was then, I guess, an ex-president, was there. And that day, and I can't remember what job I had or even what year it was. And anyway, I posed a very naughty question. I threw this at Murrow. I said, with all the correspondence from, Shire and, well, not Shire, he left, but anyway, others. I said, gentlemen, you often refer to your authoritative sources. Just who are these authoritative sources? And the whole room broke up in laughter, including Truman.